The truth is, though, we just didn't have media representation. And to this day, I feel like we still really don't. I don't feel like people really understand our issues. They don't understand the oppression dynamics that we face in Canada. I think a lot of people think we're, all sparkly clean and have lots of human rights. And meanwhile, there's not clean drinking water for First Nations. And that's really problematic. So for me, it was really starting that journey of what is actual representation.
Quay Nindaluizi Pam Palmater, and I'm the host of this show, The Warrior Life. I'm a lawyer, professor, author, and activist from Eel River Bar First Nation, and my motto is education for action, not awareness, action on Indigenous rights, social justice, and protecting the planet. On this podcast, you're going to get an education of a totally different kind, one that's enriched by the cultures, insights, and lived experiences of a wide variety of Indigenous peoples. It could be authors, artists, musicians, academics, as well as leaders and activists and land defenders and water protectors, all of them who are on the front lines of Indigenous resistance, resurgence, and revitalization. And honestly, I don't know what it is about Native podcasters, but I am addicted to having them on my show. I think they're so cool. They are literally the people that I look up to in this area. And so you have to stay tuned because you're going to listen to two Native podcasters spilling the tea. Welcome back to the Warrior Life Podcast. I'm your host, Pam Palmater. And can I say, seriously, how pumped I am for today's show? I get to welcome a literally world-famous, award-winning Native podcaster who is just kicking ass and taking names out there. I mean, Michelle Robinson has obviously this amazing award-winning podcast called the Native Calgarian. Most of my listeners probably already listened to her, but she does a million other things. So many things I couldn't even get through it all in this introduction. She's the co-chair of the Grassroots, Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls in Two-Spirit Calgary Committee, and I think Grassroots engagement is so important. She's a co-founder of Voices, a group advocating for Two-Spirit and queer people of color in Calgary. She has so many things, a co-founder of Sovereign Spirit, an Indigenous nonprofit for Two-Spirit, Indigiqueer, and LGBTQ2IA+. And you'll hear about everything else that she does. But instead of me talking all day, which would be really annoying and boring, let's welcome to the podcast, Michelle Robinson. Welcome to the Warrior Life Podcast.
I am so honored to be here. I'm so grateful you came on mine. I'm just I'm over the top. I feel everything you just said about you, and I've felt that way since long before I Don't Know More. It was wonderful.
Oh my gosh. It just seems like an age ago. And I know we had so much fun recording me on your podcast last time because I was just so excited to be there. It was hard not to talk really, really fast and not jump around in my seat. But, I think it's really important for us as podcasters to support one another and the work that we do and try to get our messages, because everything we do in all these Native podcasts, a little bit different. Everything we do, the way we approach it, the guests we have, the issues we talk about, a little bit different. So the more our listeners can hear a wide variety of Native voices, they'll understand, hey, wait a second, there's not just one omnipresent Indigenous voice on everything. And to me, when I was on your podcast, it's different when you're listening to your podcast. But when I'm on your podcast and seeing how you are conducting the podcast, to me, you just seem like a natural. You make it look so easy. And I have 1,000 questions about that. But before I get into it, because, I'm a lawyer, totally going to interrogate you about all the things that I just love about you and your work. Maybe you'd like to introduce yourself and the nation that you come from in whatever way that you like.
Sure. Oki naganago mekoche jistokom aki. I attempted to say, hello, my name is Red Thunder Woman in Blackfoot because I am in Blackfoot territory and I think I have to honor where I am first and foremost. I am Satu Dene. I am a voting member of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. My mother is from Yellowknife. My grandmother is from further north in Satu territory, as well as my grandfather. And my great grandfather's cabin right now is under fire threat. So I'm hoping it will, and this is in the town of Fort Good Hope. So I'm hoping that it won't burn down, and I'm hoping I can take my daughter up there so that they can see it and be able to connect a little more with who we are and where we come from. And so as a Satu Dene member, I try to obviously acknowledge that I'm a visiting nation to this area that I was born in I've been in most of my life. And I thought it was fun to call my podcast Native Calgarian because even before I went down the anti-racism route and the Indigenous education route, that was just one of those things that bothered me when non-natives would call themselves a Native Calgarian. So I was like, I'm going to own that term. So that's a bit about me. Thank you again for having me on your podcast here, Pam. I appreciate it.
I'm so excited. And I just love that SEO is going to take everybody who Googles, hey, Native Calgarian. Oh, it's going to take them to your podcast and get a real earful as opposed to everyone who just claims to be a Native Calgarian. So I really like that. One of the things that I get asked all the time, and I think it's really important for people just to know, where we're coming from is, when did you get into podcasting? Pretend I don't know already. And why? Why did you take up podcasting? It's a lot of work. It's a lot of research. It's a lot of editing, social media promotion. It's like a full-time job in and of itself. Why on earth would you do this?
I sometimes I really reflect on that, and I have a million more answers than I should. The truth is, though, we just didn't have media representation, and to this day, I feel like we still really don't. I don't feel like people really understand our issues. They don't understand the oppression dynamics that we face in Canada. I think a lot of people think we're, all sparkly clean and have lots of human rights, and meanwhile, there's not clean drinking water for First Nations, and that's really problematic. So for me, it was really starting that journey of what is actual representation. And the other part is a lot of folks who are in mainstream media who are Indigenous are really I don't want to use violent terms, but they really are unable to say their truth without possibly getting edited out by an editor or losing their job for pushing too much. And I want to think of like Wab Canoe when he was doing Eighth Fire, and he said, I want to say Indian residential school survivor. And there was conflict with that. And he said, this is a hill I'm willing to die on. And it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be we are going to lose our jobs over pointing out racism and trying to do structural change. And that is the problem that I see right now. And I see it in all the institutions. Like, I feel like almost if I could have a daily podcast, I would, because if I had the resources, I would do it, because there literally are daily occurrences of racism and anti-Indigenous bias that happen in Calgary, in Canada, that I think we could address. And we just don't have the resources to be able to really put it all out there. So sometimes my podcast is me just sitting go, and on Monday this happened, on Tuesday this happened, on Wednesday this happened, on Thursday. You just go through it so quick, because it's always right there. There's always teaching moments of examples to say, we can do better here by this, by that. And to be honest, our ancestors have given us so many great reports to work with, like between the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the National Inquiry and the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And like, there are multiple provincial and territorial reports that come out annually that we can say, hey, here's the proof, do the change, here's the solution. Because that's the other thing. I think that solutions are there. It's just a matter of people in positions of power implementing them. It's really that simple.
Well, I love that. And if some billionaire philanthropist is listening to Pam Palmater of the Warrior Life podcast and Michelle Robinson of the Native Calgarian podcast, and you want us to do even more work, we are more than happy to take millions of dollars to make this a daily podcast. Just putting that out there into the universe. But aside from that, again, pretend there's a new listener who's wondering, hey, what do you do on the Native Calgarian podcast? Do you just review the news? Do you just talk about issues? Is it just you? Do you have guests? Like, what can people expect?
Yeah. So when I can get guests, I definitely have them on. So, for example, we had 2 episodes with an elder and a person who was a part of the Indigenous gathering place. And we were talking about trying to create an actual Indigenous space here in Calgary, in Mohkinstsis. That's what the Blackfoot call this area, the place where the 2 rivers meet, the confluence. And so we are trying to get a space. Like, to this day, I just can't go light a smudge anywhere, have a sacred fire. And actually, because of the water restrictions that are happening today in Calgary, I can't even light a ceremonial fire without going a whole bunch of bureaucracy through the Calgary Fire Department. And that's not something I'm willing to do. It's insulting. But I will say, because of the water pipe that we had that burst, we actually don't have proper pressure in our fire hydrants to be fighting a lot of fires. So for me, obviously my great grandfather's cabin up north under threat, I just feel like it's the wrong thing for me to do right now, to have any ceremonial fire. So every full moon, I open up my backyard to urban Indigenous folks and let them be a part of a sacred fire with the full moon and have those conversations that they need to let go. And it is more Indigenous centered, because a lot of us are still reclaiming who we are. And as you know, Pam, we have the inherent right to practice our ceremonies. And just because somebody else thinks they have jurisdiction over us doesn't mean that's true. So I want to always empower our youth and other Indigenous people reclaiming who they are, to know how to do that and take it back to their home fires and talk with their elders, et cetera, et cetera. But in an urban setting, that's not easy, because not everyone has access to a fire pit. And I do. So obviously I'm going to open up my backyard to folks.
That's awesome. I love that your podcast kind of spreads out into the community. It's like, okay, going to do a podcast. Oh, wait a minute. This elder said this. Okay, I'm going to follow that trajectory after this podcast and go into the community. And I think that community work is so important. And I love how your podcast talks about that, not just like one issue. So in addition to guests, are there ever times when it's just you on there talking?
Yeah, I love saying solo, Michelle, but my editor, he always changes it to, no, you need a better title than that. But I do love talking solo, because sometimes for me, it's just getting things off my chest. I actually find it very healing to talk about, you're not going to believe what this is, because other Indigenous people know. Like, we have this art piece here that is literally an appropriation of a sacred ceremony that we used to do when people passed. And that is public art by Calgary with non-Indigenous led. Like, it's just like, there's some things that only you would understand and maybe other Indigenous people would understand, but settlers, they don't always understand what I'm talking about. So it's kind of funny to see where those gaps are. And that's why I always encourage people to ask questions, because if you're a settler listening and you're not sure, let me know. But if you're Indigenous and you're outraged, let me know. I need validation, folks. It's not just me. So that, yeah, I try to bring up the topics of the area. And because obviously we're in oil and gas country, fossil fuels, we have a lot of fighting between different orders of government. There's a lot of stuff that happens here on a regular, and just like little tiny anti-Indigenous pieces are coming out off all over the place from these 2 orders of government fighting. And I'll never forget when the Kenny government had this war room, and they attacked. I have a problem with the representation of Sasquatch on cartoons, and they were attacking them anyway because there was a cartoon about Sasquatch, and they weren't fighting for Indigenous rights. They were fighting the environment, climate change activist theme throughout the movie. And I'm like, I'm mad at the movie anyway, because we wouldn't have the Lord and Jesus Christ acting like a silly cartoon figure then have a whole war room in the Department of Alberta government go after it. Like I just can't even. So like things like this happen all the time here. And that, again, that's why I wish I had a daily one instead of just weekly. So it's really exciting to, talk about these issues, but also let's kind of get off some of the negative things and talk about the positive things. Like we have amazing things happening here in Calgary that doesn't always get the amplification it should. Like, for example, we have Native Diva Creations, who is going to New York and going to Europe and talking about fashion, jewelry, and accessories, going along with people who I could never imagine walking down a runway with. We have, like, I'm wearing a T-shirt right now that is the Predator, because we had this wonderful production of The Prey here, and my daughter said, "You should have led the Predator series with this, Mom," because that was absolutely their favorite one. So that bigger picture is that we have all these amazing things that are happening here, and amazing artists that come out of Calgary that just don't get talked about enough. And they're doing this great work internationally, let alone nationally, let alone locally, right? So that bigger picture, that we want to amplify the good voices doing good things too, because we don't see that enough in mainstream either.
Exactly. And I think that balance is important because, for the most part, Native people know what's happening and the issues that we're cranky about. But like you said, the really cool people out there being warriors don't often get their voices amplified enough, or what they're doing, like artists and authors and all those other things. That's why I just love having a wide variety of people on my podcast, because you just get to talk to so many people. And one of the things I love, and I had just mentioned this, that how your podcast, the people you talk to, the issues, and I'm going out into the community to do something. And I'd love it if you talked about some of the community work that you do, because I said in the intro that you sit on a grassroots committee about murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I think you, Pam, out of all people, would remember when we really had no infrastructure, no structure at all when it came to the conversation of what was happening to the exploitation of Indigenous peoples here. And but we, unfortunately, we're seeing our members in community, our family members, our friends, and they're dealing with the loss of loved one and incredible injustices, from lack of media representation to police not really investigating those missing people and or murdered people. Worse, when people were murdered, just calling it a suicide. I apologize for these languages. I normally would give a trigger warning for that. Those bigger pictures is that we had no supports. And the victims assistance unit, etc., like, they would only work a short period during the work week. So if a death happened on a Thursday, we have 4 days of sacred fire, and they're not even calling them until maybe the next week on a Wednesday, when all of the biggest part of the crisis is had to be dealt with, right? So we had to create this, and one of our leaders here in Calgary, she brought me in, and we had a really huge committee of people doing this fantastic work, and I got to help be a part of that in a leadership position for quite some time. And now we have a little bit of funding, so we have some positions in a federal and provincial setting now of folks that are in those positions. But again, I think they need support, because you can't have one person doing the work when, unfortunately, as you know, we have multiple deaths that happen within a week. So, they're spread very thin about who and what the resources can go to as well. So, we're not there yet. We need to have anti-racism training, Indigenous education. We need to have Indigenous specific cultural supports, and we're not there yet. We're just starting to create a bit of an infrastructure. So those grassroots folks that are a part of this committee here in Calgary, we actually just honored one of them. Unfortunately, she had lost her sister in a police what do they call that, Starlight Tour, unfortunately. And so she found her voice, and she started to talk about this issue, and was just recognized with a Chief Crowchild Award here that the city of Calgary does. And that is nominated by, grassroots people nominating our people and saying, hey, this person is doing this work. And, and it starts with these grassroots committees and helping empower people and helping healing. And then they get into these positions of leadership, and then our people are safer as a result. And my hope is that my child will one day live a better life because of the work that you have done, our ancestors have done, what we're doing today, and what's going to keep ongoing, continuing, and building with hope.
Oh my gosh, it's so good. And I find there's so much goodness in grassroots. And that's not to say that formal organizations are all bad, or that, government appointed committees are all bad, because I know our people are always coming from different perspectives and they're trying their best with limitations. But there's just something so unique about grassroots, where people are not beholden to anybody or anything, and they can say exactly, hey, we really want to keep our women safe. Like, we need to do something. And they show that passion and dedication to that. And one of the other bits of community work, and not that it's separate, because you can see how it kind of overlays, is your work in the Two-Spirit community. And that's another issue that does not, even in today's day and age, does not get enough attention. And so I really want my listeners to hear, what are you doing in this community, and what are some of the issues?
Yeah. So first I'll say, as a straight cis woman, I'm a guest in the queer community. So it is really important for me to always acknowledge that I don't have the experience of a queer person. But what I did find in the committee talking about missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, we miss the Two-Spirit a lot. And I would argue they are the most vulnerable group that we have in Canada. I talk about how all of land that was here across Turtle Island was queer until the straight agenda was imposed. And so for me, it's really important that we always acknowledge that the Two-Spirit are the most vulnerable. And so I try to encourage queer organizations who may unknowingly have anti-Indigenous bias to start acknowledging by including us in our acronym. So we were here first, so we should be too. And that actually I was schooled by the youth, our queer youth, and said, why do you put us at the end of the acronym? We were here first. So that's why, if you notice, I always say 2S LGBTQS now, because they schooled me properly. And honestly, that's a great teaching that you can tell everybody to help amplify why Two-Spirit are so important. And what I do find is there is a lot of racism in the queer community. I know a lot of people might be surprised to hear that, but when Black Lives Matter Toronto stopped that parade in 2016, that started that conversation here in Calgary. And so that's where the foundation of voices was. And we had folks from the Filipino community, folks from the Black community, two of us from the Indigenous community. We were talking about this and trying to educate the rest of Pride. At that time, there was no infrastructure for Pride nationally. And it wasn't until recently that there has been structural monies going now into Prides nationally. But Pam, you and I are probably the only people in Canada that will happily talk about how it is most of that funding is still going to municipal policing, so that when they have their Pride parade, the police are there, even though they are a lot of the times the perpetrator of the violence against Indigenous people and also the queer Indigenous people. So for me, it's really important to talk about the importance of the Two-Spirit, and especially in the conversation of missing and murdered and exploited people, because that isn't being talked about enough. And I have, two transgender family members. My child has recently come out as queer, and something we're trying to do as a family is decolonize. And our language had to invent he and she. So we're trying to use they, them as often as possible, even if we are very feminine presenting or very masculine presenting, because that was how we spoke before colonization. So, and that bigger picture too is that absolutely get mad at me for using they, them, so that I can try to school folks on why it's so important to use they, them, so that our non-binary and trans community can feel accepted. And especially in our circles, we need to make them safer Because as you know, homophobia, transphobia, and sexual violence was taught to us by outsiders. And so now we're trying to heal from all of that too. So that puts our Two-Spirit exceptionally vulnerable. And that's why it's so important to talk about it and make sure that they get their space. So when I can have them speak on issues, I absolutely bring them in and have them talk about it, because it's incredibly important. They are most sacred. On all across Turtle Island, they are most sacred. And every Two-Spirit that I've ever heard speak, I learn from. Every single one.
Mhm.
So that's why it's so important to put them in our leadership positions and empower them to do that.
Exactly. And to help give a voice where, if media is not listening, well, then, you talk to Two-Spirit people and say, hey, what's happening in our communities, in our Native communities in that realm. And the other thing I really like about you is you don't ever shy away from always advocating for Indigenous peoples. For example, conservationists and environmentalists for decades and decades doing phenomenal work trying to save the planet and plants and animals and bugs and everything, you name it. But for many, many decades, we didn't have a voice there. We weren't seen as the ones who had the knowledge about that. We weren't included in the advocacy. Some of their solutions would actually hurt Native people, and they didn't know because they didn't talk to us. So, we tried to gently work on this relationship, not to say we're against environmentalists and conservationists, but it's like, hey, we're in this fight together. There's a lot of solidarity. You need to understand some of the ways in which the things you say might be a little bit racist, or how you're not really acting in solidarity. You're kind of acting like as our voice instead of giving us a voice. And I love that you did that in the queer community too, because in every community, no matter where it is, people are behind on Indigenous issues. It's like, feminism. Like, I love women's feminism, but think of how many hundreds of years they totally ignored Native women and were supportive of bad things happening to Native women. So it's helping to bring all of these groups up to speed on, hey, here's how to do it respectfully and responsibly and, respecting our rights. And then if they don't, then that's where there's an issue, And so I really like that you're like, hey, you might not know about this, but here's some of these issues, because, like I said, everything is not just information for awareness. In fact, I hate the word awareness.
Yeah.
Great work's been done by elders and cultural advisors and knowledge keepers under the banner of awareness, because that was the limitation that they had. Like, here, make us aware. But I really like the action part. And one of the things that you're involved in is reconciliation. And kind of more formally, not just, hey, I have a podcast, let's talk reconciliation. But can you talk about some of the reconciliation work that you do?
Sure. You know what? I've been really blessed to have a few of the folks that started this book club with me in 2016 still with me. But at a certain point in time, once you know the reports and once you know what's wrong, it's like, we got to do more. So that was really the impetus of starting that. We had this school here called the Langevin School. And there were other settler folks who had tried to raise awareness that, this guy started the Indian residential school system. And so this maybe shouldn't be a person we have a bridge landmark to, as well as a school. But their voices were ignored. And the wonderful thing is, Pam, these institutions, they're able to somehow try to keep these things quiet. So even though over multiple years, many of us were trying to tell folks, you got to change these names. And here's why. The resistance to it was incredible. So the name Langevin name change then became the Reconciliation Action Group, because Langevin was just one out of a million things in the city alone that we could talk about, where that needed to be education and there needed to be change. So we started the Reconciliation Action Group. Our mandate is that we are always advocating for the 94 calls to action, and we are always advocating for the 231 calls to justice. And because we know these institutions try to ignore us, now when we try to call them in, we'll talk about this call to action, this call to justice, and how by honoring these two, you can actually honor both of these reports in the hopes that it will help motivate people to make those, incredible changes that need to be done. Because I don't want to send my daughter to a school that says John A. Macdonald. I don't want to put them in there, or worse, a Catholic school that has Bishop Grandin, who was also one of the perpetrators of violence against our people. Recently, Winston Churchill statue went up. So I talked about Molly Maloney. She was this Irish protester who would always ring a cowbell every time he spoke, and it annoyed him so much that he would leave if she showed up because she was offended about not being able to vote and what he had said. But that bigger picture, it was like, I'm going to take that as an activist. And we were, how can we make fun with this? So a lot of times you'll see me at a protest and I'll bring a cowbell and I'll be ringing it if somebody's speaking that doesn't need to be speaking.
I love that. I need a cowbell.
We all need cowbells.
Cowbell.
More cowbell.
I used to have a megaphone for the big protesting days, but I loaned, I don't know how many megaphones I had, and I ended up loaning them out. And of course, never got them back, but that's good because that megaphone's out the world, causing good trouble. And I love that. Like, I love that you're focusing on action and really addressing everything, because the thing about reconciliation, there's the symbolic, there's the substantive, but they all work together. What's the good of saying, oh, there's no relationship more important than the one with Native people, than having a statue of Cornwallis right in front of my school? And Cornwallis was one who issued scalping bounties on Mi'kmaq people. Really, we need to change things around. So I'm so glad that you do that. And the other thing, my question was around your book club. Is that something that's part of the Reconciliation Action Group? Is it part of your podcast? Is it separate? Like, what is it? And how do people participate?
Once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away in 2016, when there was funding for a position with me in a nonprofit, we started a book club. And from that, it became monthly. And then when the funding ran out, it didn't matter. I was just going to keep going. And then when COVID hit, I was like, why don't we just start putting this on the podcast for folks who can't attend when we have this? So technically it is separate, but I include it on the podcast because sometimes I'm even lucky enough to get an author to come on and talk about their book. And to me, that as you know, that's a podcast, and that should be recorded for everybody to hear, so that if folks do miss reading that book and miss talking about it with us, we can still talk about it later. And so, I think it's important to have that. The Reconciliation Action Group, we meet on basically every second Sunday. I think for the summer, we might meet once a month, but we're constantly emailing each other over everything that we can think of. And so, for example, one of our fellow activists in Montreal, Ellen Gabriel, she is going to be doing a conversation about Palestine coming up on Wednesday. So we're forwarding that to the group in the hopes that they can, be a part of that as well. Because, to me, it is important that we talk about this. I have a few podcasts on Palestine, but, sometimes hearing it from you a little different, or hearing it from her a little different, or hearing it from someone else a little different helps people understand it better and the similarities. So to me, it's really important that we're always amplifying each other's voices, because, and this is just of schooling. Anyone who's ever gone to school knows that a teacher has to say something, 7 times or something for people to get it. So if they hear it 5 times from me and once from you and once from Ellen, it may really come together why this is so important.
Oh my gosh, I know. And before I let you go, I want to talk about the situation in Palestine, because I mean, you're going to have to pretend that I don't know what your position is, because I have been working on this, but Ellen has just been leading. You know what? Let's just jump into that now, honestly, because now you've got me enraged about Palestine. So on the weekend, I had Alex Neve, who's the former Secretary General for Amnesty International. He's an international human rights lawyer. He knows everything about everything inside and out, and not political rhetoric. So we held a live that wouldn't be about what we think, what should. It was, okay, what is the law on crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide? What did the International Criminal Court say? What about the Court of Justice? What are the differences? So that people could understand, here's what a war crime is. Oh, look, that's what's happening. That's a war crime. So that we take it away from the politics of it, because, you know, it's so messy. So I'd love to hear from you, because I know Ellen has been out there from the very beginning, calling out this genocide and the atrocities that continue, you know, and it's been 9 months now, at least this last segment, but we know it goes on longer than that. So what are you saying around this? How are you talking to people, and what are you advocating for? Because this is life and death.
Oh, 100%. You know, for me, obviously, occupation, Britain trying to impose Israel back in the Balfour Decree in like 1918. To me, that's no different than the doctrine of discovery, a million other policies that have been imposed on our people here. So when we see oppression dynamics, and they're very clear oppression dynamics, where you have the Israeli army that has so much funding and media behind it, as opposed to and colonial media. And I think that's the big difference that people don't understand, is that because they're not used to hearing Indigenous media and oppression dynamics, they don't have anti-racism training, they don't have Indigenous education, they don't see the parallels between Palestinians and Indigenous people here across Turtle Island. So from my point of view, you know, I try to amplify Justice for Palestinians. It's a group based here in Calgary. And more recently, like, we're talking about this way back in, 2014. And now today we have this happening, and there's a few new groups with lots of, I want to say kids, but they're young adults and teens that are obviously understanding now the gravity of the brutality of settler colonialism with the violence that we've seen here at the U of C. And I mean, that is the same violence that Indigenous people face daily on the streets of Calgary as well. So for me, it was really important to put those together, the policies that you see from the past system and how that are these Israeli checkpoints that are all throughout Palestine. You know, these conversations need to be happening so that people understand it. Obviously, Ellen's been doing this work forever, as have you. And same with Alex. He has been one of our strongest advocates, whether it's our issue, Palestinians. And so I try to, talk and amplify about the groups that are there. Try to educate Muslims. We have very conservative Muslims in Calgary. And so I try to respect that there's a cultural difference there too. But we have some really great people who are Muslim, who are part of the Indigenous world and will come to our events and try to educate their families from within as well. And then we also have the Jewish Voices for Peace here. So I try to work with them as independent Jewish voices, I try to work with them, and they work in conjunction with Justice for Palestinians. So we have some really good folks out in this area doing the good work of advocating for the lives of Palestinians as they undergo this horrible genocide in Gaza. And we also have Mansour. He's from Calgary, and he was in Gaza at the time it happened. And I was just like on edge for a long time trying to get him out of there. And his mom, a loud advocate in Toronto, doing that hard work to try to get him out. So when he was finally snuck out of Gaza, and now he's doing the work internationally to try to bring that English voice to what the reality is on the ground. And so, you know, for me, it's quite easy to amplify the Palestinian voices that need to be amplified, the Muslim voices that need to be amplified. But there are Jewish Palestinians and there are Christian Palestinians. So I do try to amplify their voices too, to showcase that we all want peace. This is a basic human right, is to, you know, have peace and have food, have shelter, shelter, have water, and yet we are denying a whole segment of people that, just like in Canada, where we have, denied our traditional territories, we've been denied clean drink and safe drinking water, and we've been denied economic opportunities that Canadians have gotten. There hasn't been dollar-to-dollar funding, et cetera, and that oppression dynamic is so clear with the Palestinians, and trying to educate Canadians on that is a tough go. But as you know, a job is just a job. For me, this is about Indigenous rights. This is about the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, where Palestinians have the same right to their culture as we have rights to our culture here. And these are important documents that we can prove, as well as the great work that obviously Amnesty International did under his reign and continue to do. And so just teaming up with groups like that to make sure that we try to educate Canadians the best that we can. And, I follow lots of United Nations advocates, appointed folks, and amplify their voices on Gaza, because they're telling everyone this isn't, it's not a secret.
One of the things that Alex said that really struck me in our YouTube live was he quoted a Palestinian woman who said that this is going to be the first time ever that a genocide is going to play out live on social media for people to see it. So it's not like we didn't know it was happening, or we only found out after 1 million people were exterminated, or any of those kinds of things. It's literally, hey, wait, this is happening. Can you intervene? Because all of these countries who came up with the UN Convention for the prevention and elimination of genocide, or the punishment of genocide, kept saying never again, never again, never again, never again. So for me, I'm like, oh gosh, when it first started happening, I'm not Palestinian. What should I be saying? What should I be doing? So obviously I just followed what Palestinians were saying. And I was equally watching what people from Israel were saying, because there was a large number of people from Israel saying, hey, that we don't want that. Like, do not make this about all Israelis. Like, that's that government, and we have no say in that. And then you see more and more Jewish groups coming out saying this doesn't represent Jewish people either. And so, when things first happen in any scenario, I'm watching for the people that are involved about like what's happening, and to understand the history and the context. And when you have all of these people saying, this is not us, we do not support genocide and extermination, war crimes, crimes against humanity, we do not support attacking hospitals and mothers and babies and aid workers, like that actually gave me a lot of hope that countries would take faster action than they have. But just to even get our own country to get to a point where they can say, oh, you know what, maybe there should be some kind of pause, or maybe we should think about, the arms, the way in which we're involved in, arms trade. And it's like, are you serious? While people are literally starving to death. So I'm so glad you advocate on that. Ellen is just, she's on another level. She's just, she saw it right away. She called it out right away. She continues to do that to try to keep it front and center. And again, why I did the live, because I wanted people to hear, okay, there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of myths and misinformation about what is and isn't happening, like genocide versus the right to defend yourself as a country. And what there is no like there's no balancing. Like genocide is always illegal. It doesn't matter what precipitated it. It's always illegal. Yes, any state has the right to defend themselves against people who are attacking them or their citizens. Fine. But that doesn't mean you engage in collective punishment and just, scorched earth the entire Palestinian people. So thank you for actually being a voice and for supporting Palestinians and Israelis and Jewish organizations and Muslim organizations and Christian organizations all saying, this is wrong. We need urgent help. Because I think when it doesn't come from the people, politicians are like, it's not really a big issue. Maybe we don't have to worry about it. I think we should make them worry about it. That's for sure.
Yeah. And look at the movement to divest. and to boycott. Even myself, I mean, I wasn't much of a Starbucks drinker beforehand, but I was a McDonald's coffee drinker, and I have gone without because I cannot support that in any capacity. And when you talked about it being live on my social media, like my phone has been going off the hook since October 7th, and with images you will never unsee. At the end of the day, we need to be seeing them. And I know that a lot of the algorithms are trying to stop that from happening.
Mhm.
So I really do encourage people to reach out to your local Palestinian group and find out, what medium they're using so that you can see what the truth is, what's going on. I notice when there are media blackouts. And so then you'll go on Twitter and see Palestinians saying, oh my God, I cannot get a hold of my mother. I can't get a hold of folks in my family. And so it's real, it's happening. And it's hard because in a way, I wish we could get off of these pro-Israeli social medias, but that's where we're all on right now. And so if we can share some of this information through our podcast, through your podcast, through other ways, we will. And that's why it's so important, of course, to have independent media, because there are some really great pieces coming out from independent media, but unfortunately it's at a massive cost, and we have never seen so many journalists lose their lives in a conflict. And just when I eat an olive, all I can think of is Palestinians. When I see a kite, all I think of are journalists that lost their lives trying to tell the truth. And so this is real issues that we need to be talking about, protecting our journalists, protecting our education institutions after what the outcries that we have seen against our own students, like how you can beat our own children, I will never understand. So these are things we have to start talking about protecting our democracy, protecting our institutions, and preferably with a decolonizing lens so that maybe some Indigenous people can educate people. Because I think the biggest thing that happened since October 7th was we've seen the shortcomings of all the DEI, so-called, structural changes going into these institutions, because if they were meaningful, if they were real, they would be coming from a decolonizing lens. And we are not seeing that conversation when it comes to Palestine and Israel and that bigger picture, that we need to see that with our students who are on the other end of the baton or bullets. It's not nice what's happening across North America by people who are speaking out against genocide. It should never be a bad thing to speak out against genocide when you see it. And that's not even talking about Congo and the Sudan. These places are undergoing some genocides right now, and we're not seeing any media on that either. And we should always be speaking out against genocide. And as you know, we, through policy, are undergoing genocides here. And people don't want to talk about that here either. So that's why we have to continue with independent media.
And thank goodness for that, because we own our websites, we own our podcasts, we own our YouTubes. You know what I mean? Like our own videos. Like owning our own stuff is so important. Obviously, I use social media. I use Twitter and Facebook and Instagram to get the word out. But ultimately, if Twitter, now X, wants to say, you know what, we don't want to hear any critique of Israel, so we're just going to ban any tweets, they end up doing that. So shout out to all the student encampments who were out there risking their graduation, risking their diplomas, their degrees, risking their personal freedom, risking fiscal safety, saying, you told us to never again on genocide. We're standing up for you to end genocide. So good on them. I feel like that action is as important of an education that as someone talking about it. Like, you need that part too. It can't just be an academic issue where we sit and say, well, according to this, it's this and that and the other thing. And one of the things I really like about your website is you are so committed to education. So you've got your podcast, you're talking about current issues, you're lifting voices of people. You've got your book club, which is so amazing. I love book clubs because I'm like a book nerd too. You're out there in community educating. And one of the things I noticed, something I don't have on my website, is you also, in addition to all of that, offer services. services that rightfully should be paid for, like coming in and doing a speaking engagement on land acknowledgements. Like here's the beginning of it. Here's what you need to do, or to even do a proper land acknowledgement, or someone wants to take up your time and ask you questions and pick your brain. And the fact that you're like, okay, here's the cost to that, because there's a labor associated with that. There's a sort of professional experience and background and, lived experience that you bring to the table, and other people doing that get paid for that. And like, I love that you're like, well, if you cancel, there's a cost to that. If you want me to review a big, long legal agreement, well, you're going to have to pay for the lawyer to help me get legal advice. Like, can you talk about that just a little bit? I know we're getting, towards the end, but to me, Indigenous people getting recognized and compensated for their labor is such a pet peeve, because I don't know for how many years I didn't get a cent. I didn't get anything for doing a lot of work for other people.
Yeah, I find that when you are accessible, especially through social media, you have a lot of people that will send you that private message to pick your brain, or worse, they'll be, oh, let me buy you coffee. And really what it is interrogation. And like, I really love the First Nation Information Governance Center, and they talk about the OCAP principles about ownership, control, access, and possession, because basically people are trying to bypass us, trying to bypass our people, our nations, and just trying to pick our brain in order to get that. So what I found that for me, I had a geomatics background before I really had my daughter, and was forced to walk the anti-racism world and advocate for our people. That bigger picture that, people want to do land acknowledgements, but they don't even know how to say the names. They don't know why they're saying it. So that there's full education behind that, because you and I know these treaties were the original agreements, but they are not taught that in K-12. They're not taught that in post-secondary. And sometimes they are. And I'm going to give a shout out to the U of A for their wonderful free Indigenous education program that they have. That bigger picture is that people don't know. So if you want to know, we are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder on purpose. That was done through policy, as you know, through the Indian Act. The very least you can do is compensate me for that. And then to expect me to, get a lawyer and go through your agreements. And that's not appropriate. I was lucky enough to be a part of the TikTok Accelerator program. And like, there are real horror stories of how we are misused in order for some corporation to try to sell a product or something like that. And so I've never gone down that road. But for me, land acknowledgements are the basis of understanding the oppression dynamics. They're the basis of understanding that Canadians are treaty partners with the government signing on their behalf. So that bigger picture is that, know what you're saying, know whose land that you're on, that you are on stolen land. And we are kind enough not to seek retribution. We just want to be included in and honor those treaties with the spirit of equality and equity, which, as you know, we are not there yet. So until we're there, we're not honoring those treaties properly. And that was the foundation to Canada. So until we're there, then I'll be like, okay, probably don't need to do this, but I'll probably be retired, and there will be 10 new folks that hopefully you and I have inspired to continue to do that work on.
So important. But equally, like, I want to acknowledge you. I appreciate you for putting it out there, for actually saying, hey, you need to respect us. You need to compensate us. You need to acknowledge the labor that goes into the things that we do. Like, it's literally right out there, because so many of us, and some of it's cultural, right? You never want to ask for anything. You never want to say anything that might cause conflict. And so that meant that, I did, I think, 15 years with just doing massive amounts of research and speaking and giving people answers. They'd say, hey, what section of the Indian Act in 1920? And it's like, okay, half a day. I'm going through all of these things. And I was like, wait a second.
Yeah.
Wait a second. What's happening? But that's when that started to change my mind.
Yeah.
And when other people that do the same things that we do, whether it's training or speaking, were saying, hey, this is a profession. Like, people get paid for this. People, put a lot of money.
You're going to love this, Pam. People have sent me really ignorant emails, and I have made an invoice to compensate for me reading that. Because, like, honestly, we like in Calgary, especially, we talk about money, 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 and people think free means it's not worth anything. So I think too, it is part of the culture of Calgary where it's like, no, I had to go to SAIT and I had to pay a lot of money to have the small bit of geomatics drafting I had under my belt. I had to put up with a lot of racism in the oil and gas industry, a lot of sexism for that matter. And you know what? Yeah, you can pay me for my experience, let alone the fact that, especially when we're talking about, Indian residential school survivors, watching what my family went through, this is not okay. Like, I can't believe people don't understand the gravity of that. Like, and I think I'll say Romeo Dallaire is one of my inspirations. If he can get paid to talk about genocide, and arguably he wasn't necessarily the helper in a lot of ways, but he had to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. Why is it that we expect every single Native to talk about really traumatic things that, as you know, we're all healing from, and yet not even be properly compensated for? No way. Not anymore. Not under my watch. And if you want to find someone to do it for free, go right ahead. But I will charge people for even sending me really horrible emails, because I think it's important that people know you can't just send stuff to people. And I remember when I first joined the community, and people would say, well, we tried to contact a person, but they never got back to us. And I always think we could probably do a full episode and reading out some of the horrible emails we get in a day from well-meaning people who just had no idea what they said was so racist.
Oh my gosh. I know. It's like, well, and they never got back. So much for reconciliation. I just figured, well, I'm going to end that. And I'm like, what? You reached out once? Or when they ask you to come in and do, say, a full day of training, and what they're offering is, we will make a donation to X organization on your behalf.
Yeah.
But you won't get paid. And I'm like, well, okay. So not only are you not paying me, that's bad enough, but now you're asking me to donate my money to an organization instead of you doing it. Like, that's doubly wrong, as if, like, that just makes no sense whatsoever. Anyway,
I agree. And you know what? Part of the reason why I do it is because I've seen an elder do exactly that. Come from the reserve, travel out, do a presentation, and get like a pen. And I've had that happen where I went out to Canmore, did a presentation, and they gave me a pen. And I'm like, I spent $200 alone in gas, and you gave me a pen? Come on. And for them to do that to our elders is absolutely unacceptable. So I'd rather burn down these institutions than to subject our elders to that. And I think that is important. I'm not going to take the space of an elder because somebody doesn't budget $500 for that elder to come in from a reserve, right? Like, it is incredible the amount of people that expect free labor, not just from me, but from our elders. It's criminal, I think, especially after the stolen land, Indian residential school surviving, 60 Scoop, MMIW, the surveillance we are under, and you're not even going to pay them $200? Come on.
It's such a rant. My cousin Candy Palmater, before she passed away, she and I did an event, and the very last thing she said was like, sister or cousin, you got to charge. People make money for this. They have no problem paying men. They have no problem paying white men. They don't have no problem paying politicians and famous people and everything else. And none of them have your degrees and your knowledge and your research. So you better charge. And I didn't even have to ask. So the organization that was getting her to do that was just like, what do we pay her? Just like, you're paying her this. And I was like, yeah. But before, I hadn't actually vocalized any of that. I thought it was like a taboo or something to even say anything. But it's so insulting. Or when they say, we have a small honorarium. And then, one of my assistants will say, well, what is it? It's like, oh, well, we have $100. And it's like, well, sorry, Pam's not going to take 2 days to travel to get there to do this for $100. It's actually a lot of work and travel and labor. Yeah. So then they write back and say, okay, well, do you know who else? Can you give us some names of other Native people?
I get that all the
And
time too.
and
That's
he
when you
oh
send the invoice. Send that invoice.
oh, I do even better. My assistant writes back and I, tell him what to say. And he's like, unfortunately, we will not be referring any Native people to you or giving any contact information because we believe that they should be fairly compensated and we would never want to insult them by passing you along to them and then have you do that to them. And some of them have never written back, and it's not meant to be mean or rude or ungrateful or unthankful or all the things that they say it is. It really is just, please just pay fairly for labor, and it's as simple as that.
I'm going to bring up one more point. I know we're trying to wrap up, but that bigger
Yeah.
picture that, in Calgary, our racialized folks actually cannot find attainable education or attainable jobs after education as well. So like we have stats from the Calgary Foundation that actually show racialized people are not being properly compensated. And because of the lack of structural racism within businesses, we of course lose our job first, especially when we're like, hey, that was racist. So we lose our jobs disproportionately larger than non-Indigenous people. So what that says is, one, be quiet, and two, put up with it. And that's not right, because then we're putting up with racial battle fatigue, and that's not a healthy work environment either.
Exactly. And for those of you who were listening earlier, and Michelle was talking about how DEI isn't working for us. For those who don't know, DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. It tends to be the terms that universities use, businesses, corporations, which shows, hey, we accommodate, we're welcoming. And it doesn't end up working for Native people, especially for Native, because we're just not in the diversity, equity, and inclusion category. Another rant we could have another time. But thank you, Michelle. Oh my gosh, I learned so much from you. It was hard to even keep track of the time and questions I was supposed to be asking you. I'm just like, oh, I'm getting all this great information that all of my listeners are going to get, and then they can go out and do all this amazing stuff. So thank you for taking the time.
I'm so honored to be on your podcast, so honored to chat with you, and I would happily have you back on mine anytime to talk about the new thing that's happening across Canada that we have to talk about immediately.
That's awesome. Okay. And thank you to all the podcast listeners, the Warrior Life podcast listeners, and Native Calgarian listeners for listening, supporting, and sharing and using these podcasts for education. Thank you to all the YouTube viewers who watch this because it's easier to watch it instead of listen. That's great too. Thank you for your support. And thank you to all the closed caption readers who use YouTube as a way to engage with podcasts, but use closed caption. So to all of you, thank you for the support. Thank you for taking this and finding a way to put everything you've learned into action. Thank you for the way you support Indigenous artists and musicians and other podcasters. Anything you do to support us, that's really, really, really helpful. So till next time, keep living a warrior life. Walalia.